So here we are, the second part of the anthology of the extract from Theology and Falsification, a Symposium. And this time it's between Flew and Basil Mitchell. In order to access this part of the anthology, you need to have worked your way through the previous one between Antony Flew and Richard Hare. This essay is between Flew on the left and Basil Mitchell on the right, which starts with Mitchell replying to Flew's claim that religious language is meaningless because believers will not allow their statements to be falsified. Flew then replies, offering a criticism of Mitchell's position, and also he brings back into it Hare's response from the previous extract, which is why it's important that you've done that first. Now, here's Basil Mitchell, and this is the conclusion of the symposium, with Mitchell responding to Flew's challenge. And his challenge, if you remember, was to explain what would count for them as evidence against the love or the existence of God. Mitchell admits that the problem of unfalsifiable religious language exists, but responds with his parable of the partisan. He argues that religious believers do regard their beliefs as falsifiable, and they work through the difficulty of maintaining them in the face of contradictory evidence. But that religious faith involves a commitment, however, to trust in the existence of God, despite any of the contradictory evidence. And so here we are with part C, Basil Mitchell. And you'll see the summary in blue you should make a note of. The black boxes come up with questions which help you with the 10 mark in the exam, the 10 mark essay, to illustrate and clarify the anthology itself. And further points and questions will be posited in order to help you with the 20 mark part of the essay, which is to analyze further the extract and beyond. So here, Mitchell thinks that Flew's criticism of religion is based on misunderstanding what religious believers actually say and what they actually do. He doesn't think Flew's famous phrase, "a death by 1,000 qualifications," takes place. And he actually argues that Flew describes there what is going on with religious language is not so. So what does Mitchell link the problem of religious language to? Well, we can see here, if we begin to highlight some of the wording that's used and the phrases that are used in the extract, we can see here that Mitchell links the problem of religious language to the problem of evil and suffering. It says here, the problem of evil. So what belief does the believer have which is being contradicted every day by evil and suffering? Well, the belief the believer has, which is being contradicted every day, is that they believe God is good and that God is loving, and therefore you can see this phrase Mitchell uses, God loves men. So what does Mitchell say that the believer does recognize? Well, the religious statements about God are being falsified all the time. We find it here when he says, so the theologian does recognize the fact of pain as counting against Christian doctrine. Mitchell says they recognize that anything about God like this is going to potentially falsify him. And this happens around them all the time. But despite this, what do religious believers not allow? Well, even though they recognize this fact, Mitchell says that they do not allow the contradictory evidence to count, and we can highlight it here, decisively against it. We don't allow it to, if you're a believer, to act decisively against your beliefs that God is good or that God is love. So why does Mitchell think this? Well, he thinks that the believer is committed by his faith to trust in God. They choose to trust in God whilst still admitting that the evidence in front of them could look bad. So what does Mitchell call this, and what is the difference? Well, he makes reference to this and the opposite as being the detached observer. The difference between being a believer and being a detached observer. So here we say the believer. That's who Mitchell's referring to here. But the opposite of the true, genuine believer is the detached observer. Now, the detached observer will drop their theory the moment some contradictory evidence appears. The believer will hold on, however, to their belief to see if that contradiction ends up actually being a mistake after all. Take scientists, for example. They are detached observers. But Mitchell doesn't believe that this is what religious beliefs are like. Believers don't act as a detached observer. So who does he sound like he's agreeing with here at this stage? Well, Mitchell sounds like he's agreeing with Richard Hare. Now, both Hare and Mitchell agree here about the difference between scientific and religious language. If something makes scientific language meaningless, refusing to allow it to be falsified, what does this mean for religious language? Well, it means it might not make religious language meaningless after all. What about this view is similar to the thinking of someone like Wittgenstein? Well, if you remember back to Wittgenstein, the context and the function of language must be taken into account. This is called a functional view of language. It's very similar to Wittgenstein. So is Mitchell's view of what makes religious language meaningful, however, the same as Wittgenstein and Hare? Well, not so. Mitchell shows that he has a very different view as we read on in the extract. So how can we link here the attitude of the religious believer that Mitchell explains to the story of Job? Well, if you know about the story of Job, Job refused to give up his faith despite the many sufferings he endured. His livestock were annihilated, members of his family were killed, he suffered painful boils, and despite losing almost everything, Job refused to give up on his faith despite all the suffering he endured. So let's move on. Mitchell's parable is often called the parable of the partisan, or the parable of the mysterious stranger. It illustrates how religious belief can be falsified, but at the same time keeps going on despite contradictory evidence. So where does Mitchell set his parable here? Let's break his parable down. He sets it in time of war in an occupied country. What is the real context he's probably influenced by? Well, he's probably influenced by World War II or occupied France. The Marquis, the French resistance. These were brave men and women who resisted Nazi rule in France. Now, many of them were arrested, they were tortured, and they were executed. So how might the story of a very famous figure in the French resistance, such as George Blind, be relevant here? You can see an image there of George Blind. He's pictured facing execution by a firing squad, and in 1944 he refused to give up the names of other resistant fighters. He actually smiles. If you were to zoom in on that picture, you'd see him smiling down the barrel of the Nazis' guns. He defied the Nazis. They sent him to a concentration camp, actually. He didn't die in that moment. It was all a ploy to get him to give up the names. Now, Mitchell weaves a very similar idea of this into his parable, this idea of loyalty and of trust. What does the mysterious stranger represent? So let's have a look at some of these parts of the parable and break it down. So here's the stranger. Now, the stranger simply represents God in the parable. What does the partisan represent? Here's the partisan. The partisan represents a religious believer. What might the meeting in the night between the stranger and the partisan represent? So here it says, they spent that night together in conversation. Well, the idea of them being together at night is that they spend that night together in conversation. This is meant to represent a religious experience or a conversion experience. When the stranger offers help and support, what is this meant to represent? We can see here when he says that sometimes the stranger is seen helping members of the resistance. Highlight that. Well, when the stranger offers help and support to the others, the enemy, not the enemy, when he is offering help and support to the partisan who he's made friends with, this represents him receiving answered prayers or miracles or getting a blessing from God. But when the stranger helps the enemy, what does this represent? We can see here, sometimes he is seen in the uniform of the police handing over patriots to the occupying power. Well, when he seems to be helping the enemy, this represents evil and suffering. So helping the resistance, his alleged friends, looks like in the same way of God answering prayer. But when he's helping the enemy, this is the presence of evil and suffering in the world. So when people turn against the stranger, what do they represent? The friends of the partisan who notice when the stranger is helping the enemy, they turn against him. It says here, on these occasions, his friends murmur against him. Well, these people represent the atheists, or even the believers that have lost their faith because they become disillusioned, or their views have become falsified by the world around them. So the partisan represents the religious believer who, well, the religious believer keeps his faith despite the behavior of the stranger. So the partisan isn't just the believer, but the partisan represents the believer who never gives in. It says here, he still believes that, in spite of appearances, the stranger did not deceive him. He doesn't give up his faith. Now, why might Mitchell's parable here, out of the three in the symposium, we've got Flu's parable of the explorers in the jungle, the gardener. We've got Hare's parable of the lunatic. We've now got Mitchell's parable of the partisan. Why might his one be the best out of the three for religious believers? Well, this world that we live in could be considered to be a bit like a war zone, where the force of evil has occupied the territory. Perhaps the devil has occupied earth. And the forces of good coming from God might seem really distant and far away. Why might the skeptics like Antony Flew argue that the stranger is a poor analogy for God when he comes back here at Mitchell? Why might the stranger be a reasonable being to trust, but God isn't? Well, the human stranger may have restrictions for not always helping the partisan, and sometimes the stranger will need to help the enemy, as we see in the parable, such as trying to keep maybe his identity secret. The problem here is that when we compare the analogy of Mitchell to God, the stranger in the story is a man, whereas God is God and God is omnipotent. He doesn't have the same restrictions as the stranger might have. So Flew would argue that they are not a good comparison. It's reasonable to trust a stranger who might have a very good reason for being contradictory. But it would not be reasonable, it seems, to trust a being like God who has not any really good reason at all for being contradictory. So in what way might the analogy only work for those who base their religious belief on their religious experiences, perhaps? Well, let's take conversion experiences. These things are what inspire a believer to trust in God. They remember and hold on back to that experience that is undeniable to them, personal to them. Pentecostal churches in the Christian faith, for example, place a strong emphasis on glossolalia. That's the Greek word for speaking in tongues, a spiritual gift. And they expect to see that as evidence that one is filled with the Holy Spirit. Or the charismatic movement, which transcends denomination in the Christian faith, and you could be a charismatic Catholic or charismatic Baptist, whatever you might be. The charismatic movement has a particular theology that will often want to see religious experiences at the heart of evidence that Jesus is real today and that his Spirit is in the world. These things are the bases of faith that many Christians, such as those I've mentioned, will use as evidence for their faith. So maybe the analogy of Mitchell only seems to work for people that have had strong religious experiences. But what about the people that don't? What about the people that base their belief rather than on religious experience, but on their upbringing? Or perhaps on philosophical arguments they've studied, like the design or the cosmological or the ontological. They cannot identify with the partisan's night meeting with the stranger when they converse. They don't identify with needing a religious experience or conversion experience. They therefore need a different justification to continue to believe in God when they are faced with contradictory evidence. Myself personally, as a Christian, if I were to be challenged, which I am regularly, about the existence of God, about contradictions to believing in God, I can easily fall back onto specific religious experiences that I personally remember from the past. And I will always hold on to those and say that, well, for me personally, it's undeniable the existence of a being like God. But others that don't have those experiences, that believe in God, will need other different justifications when faced with a challenge. Now here is C.S. Lewis. He was a lecturer at both Oxford and Cambridge in his day. And he's also famous for the Chronicles of Narnia, producing those. But he said this: faith, in the sense in which I am here using the word, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. So what does this quote by C.S. Lewis suggest religious people don't base their beliefs on religious experiences should do when facing these contradictions? Well, he says that they should hold on to their beliefs regardless and not let their mood change them. For those that don't have religious experiences, like myself, to hold on to, they shouldn't let their mood change them. If you accept, for example, Augustine's Theodicy, but you've got great personal suffering in your life, like, for example, Flu's analogy of a child with inoperable cancer, the suffering doesn't make the problem of evil more logical suddenly. It just makes it feel more true. And C.S. Lewis suggests that we shouldn't allow those feelings to sway our original assertions. So moving on, here Mitchell admits that the evidence goes against the stranger, against God, and that the partisan, the religious believer, is ignoring the evidence. And he calls that a trial of his faith. Let's highlight that here, the trial of his faith. So how is the partisan similar here to the explorers in the jungle and the lunatic in Flu and Hare's parables? Well, the partisan in Mitchell's parable does not allow his belief in the stranger to be falsified by the contradictory evidence. We can see it at the beginning. The partisan of the parable does not allow anything to count decisively against the proposition the stranger is on our side. However, instead of just ignoring the contradictory evidence and qualifying his belief, what is the partisan actually doing? Well, what Mitchell says is the partisan, the religious believer, is wrestling with the problems he faces and working through the contradiction, the contradictory evidence. And this is, it says here, which constitutes the trial of his faith. Now, this is very much in the same way that Job had to in the story we mentioned earlier, facing those trials and working through them. Now, what are the two logical responses here that Mitchell says the partisan is likely to make when he asks for help from the stranger and doesn't get any help? Well, it says here that he must either, A, or one, give up on the idea that the stranger is on his side, and therefore he should conclude that the stranger is not on our side. Or, two, or B, he should accept that the stranger has valid reasons for refusing that he is on our side, but he has reasons for withholding his help. Clear, valid reasons. So those are the two logical responses the partisan is likely to make. Either he's no longer on our side, or he's got good reasons for looking like he isn't. Now, why would the partisan refuse to respond in the first way? Why would he refuse to simply argue that the stranger simply no longer is on his side? Well, that's because Mitchell says he has made a commitment to the stranger, or the religious believer has made a commitment to God. Now, with the second response, let's take part B, the second response. What does Mitchell accept about the partisan holding on to his belief still? Well, he does accept this, that holding on to the belief could eventually become just silly, he says, that at some point it may become too silly to still believe. So what does Mitchell believe then about the believer holding on to belief in God? Well, he's argued here that a religious believer is not going to give up on God the moment that suffering will come their way. But believing in God when the suffering becomes too great, however, can become, it says, silly. The question for Mitchell here is not whether religious beliefs can be falsified, because he believes that they can, as long as people will still be losing their faith in the world, and they do. But when they should be falsified is more of the problem here. Not can they be falsified, when should they be falsified? In other words, how much suffering should there be to make the belief silly? How much trust should we put in God reasonably? So let's consider some alternative analogies here to support Mitchell's parable and perhaps reinforce our understanding of it. Take a wedding, as you can see a picture here of the groom waiting at the front of the wedding of the church. Now imagine this particular groom was waiting for their best man to appear, and to appear on time. Often the best man has the ring to exchange. How long should you wait for your best man to appear at your wedding if they're running late? Now, some waiting would be reasonable, but eventually you're going to need to go ahead without him, surely. And if you started the wedding and you invited somebody else to quickly stand in as your best man, then the original one appeared but late into the ceremony, and he had a reasonable excuse, so it was a valid reason he was that late. You probably would feel a little bit guilty for not trusting him and waiting just that little bit longer where he would have been able to be your best man. What about the vow in a marriage? The vow, for example, in sickness and in health. How long should a couple stay together if things are going sour? If you suspect the other one is committing adultery against you? Maybe you would give in the marriage and divorce when you find proof that they are actually committing adultery. Or maybe you would forgive them the first time, and if it happens again a few more times, then you might decide that you don't stay together any longer. Or maybe if you split up early on over something very small, then clearly there wasn't commitment in the beginning, if you just had a brief argument and then you broke up. But eventually, if one person cheats on the other persistently, surely the promises, the vows in sickness and in health no longer mean anything to the other person. So it would seem reasonable to agree that trusting your best man or your spouse in a marriage are things which can be falsified, and people are understandably going to refuse the falsification the first time something contradictory comes along. Now, what would Flew call this, and what about science? Well, Flew would call this qualifying the belief. This would be his take on it. But science doesn't throw away a theory the moment some contradictory evidence appears. Scientists will persevere. Why can't religious people get to do this too? Now, moving on, Mitchell argues that no one can say in advance when a belief like this will be falsified. For Mitchell, it is important that believers experience the full force of the conflict in this triad of faith. Let's highlight that right at the end. We'll come back to that in just a moment. The full force of the conflict. Now, what does Mitchell say that you can't say about falsification? Well, he says this: you cannot say in advance when religious belief is going to be falsified. You can't tell when it's going to be falsified. So what's it going to depend on? Well, he says this: it will depend on the nature of the impression created by the stranger in the first place. It will depend too on the manner in which he takes the stranger's behavior. Lots of things, like the type of religious experiences they've had, for example. Lots of things it's going to depend on. So what does this mean for the challenges that Flew gave to the symposiasts? Well, it simply means that it cannot be answered. Why can it not be answered? What exactly is wrong with it? Well, it's not that it can't be answered because the religious belief is wrong, but Mitchell would point out here it can't be argued because Flew's question is wrong. His challenge is wrong. So what are the two responses from religious believers that Mitchell thinks are wrong? Well, let's take the first one. One believer, he says, blandly dismisses, let's highlight it here, blandly dismisses it as of no consequence. And it says he is therefore thoughtless or insane, as though the contradictory evidence never existed at all. Now, not many religious people, he argues, will ever do this. Very few would just simply dismiss the evidence and think of it as not existing. The second, the other one, might treat, it says here, and let's highlight this, they might treat a terrible disaster by saying, it is God's will. Now, this would mean redefining the words that they use about God, like good and love. Mitchell says some religious people will do this, and Flew actually attacks this earlier in the anthology. But Mitchell seems here to think that it is also an unreasonable response. Mitchell seems to agree with Flew that it would be unreasonable for a religious person to treat a terrible disaster by saying it is God's will, instead of regarding the full force of the disaster in their belief. Now, if Mitchell thinks the first response is rare and the second response is unreasonable, how does he get to answer Flew's challenge? What does he say? Well, he thinks that religious believers recognize suffering contradicts the idea of God. but they struggle to carry on trusting God regardless. Like Job, for example. So they would struggle through being able to continue to trust God like Job did, questioning things maybe at different times. Therefore, their struggle shows their idea of God is not dying the death by 1,000 qualifications. And so Mitchell gets to avoid Flu's accusation. But instead, they are going through what Mitchell calls a trial of faith, as we read earlier. And that they will suffer, as we've highlighted at the bottom of this extract, the full force of the conflict. So why is it important that they are struggling and that they're wrestling with the full force of the conflict? Well, Mitchell believes that it shows that their beliefs are falsifiable. And therefore, if it shows that, it means their beliefs are meaningful. Now, we can see Mitchell's point here with the Prophet Muhammad, when he doubted the first time he received the revelation. In Surah Yunus, chapter 10, verse 94, we read there in Arabic, but we can read in English. It says, "So if you are in doubt, O Muhammad, about that which we have revealed to you, then ask those who have been reading the scripture before you. The truth has certainly come to you from your Lord, so never be among the doubters." Now, we can see the parallel here because it's an interesting backstory to the Prophet Muhammad. His wife Khadijah took him to her cousin Waraka's house, a Christian, for advice when Muhammad doubted. And Waraka explained to him that it was the same angel Jibril who brought the revelation to Prophet Musa. And that same angel Jibril is the one who's bringing the revelation to you. That's what he was saying to the prophet. And shortly after, Waraka died, and there was a period of no revelation at all that the prophet received. And in one of the authentic hadith, known as Bukhari, it says that the prophet became so sad that he tried to throw himself off a mountain a number of times. And it was the angel Jibril who stopped him and convinced him that he actually had a divine purpose. Now, this shows that a religious believer can wrestle with doubt and they can go through a trial of faith, working through the full force of their conflict. Equally, there will be other religious believers who are thoughtless about their religion and obviously don't struggle with the pain and suffering, but they just simply give up on their faith. Or there are those that will qualify their idea of God, as Antony Flew suggests. So what would Mitchell say about these people? Well, it doesn't matter. Mitchell only has to show that some religious belief is reasonable, not that all of it is. So moving on, Mitchell now explains how his partisan differs from Hare's lunatic and why he agrees with Antony Flew rather than Hare about falsification. So what does Mitchell say is different about his partisan and Hare's lunatic? Well, he says this, and let's highlight it. He says that the partisan admits that many things may and do count against his belief. In other words, they believe that things will falsify the assertion. But, let's carry on highlighting, Hare's lunatic, it says, doesn't admit that anything counts against his blik. In other words, nothing can falsify the assertion. And that's the difference between the two. Now, what does Mitchell agree with Antony Flew about? He agrees, and we can highlight this as well, he agrees that theological utterances must be assertions. They are making claims, in other words, about the world which believers think are true, but which could be false. What does Mitchell's stranger being on our side, as we can highlight here, the stranger is on our side. What does Mitchell's stranger being on our side explain? Well, it is a proper explanation that could be true or could be false. It explains the stranger's behavior. It tells us something about their behavior. How does this explanation of the stranger then relate to God? Well, the idea of God being loving and good is a proper explanation as well. It explains God's behavior and it explains the way that the world is. What does this mean Mitchell then has to reject? Well, it means that Mitchell must reject Hare's idea that religion is a blik. So what's the key difference then between the partisan and the lunatic? Well, the partisan recognizes that there are things which count against his trust in the stranger, whereas the lunatic in Hare's parable doesn't recognize anything contradicting his insane blik. Now, religious believers will face, Mitchell says, the full force of the conflict between their beliefs and what happens in the world. God is love, for example, but suffering still exists. They go through a trial of faith, as we earlier pointed out. But the lunatic in Hare's parable never accepts for a moment that he might be wrong. Let's think about these questions. Are religious believers in reality more like Mitchell's partisan or Hare's lunatic? Well, we probably would come to the conclusion that they are more like Mitchell's partisan in reality. They'll have doubts like the Prophet Muhammad did. They'll sometimes lose their faith, like some other people do. They might go to a priest for encouragement in the church, or they might pray and ask God for more faith. In other words, what they're doing is they're wrestling with the conflict that they are facing. Now, Flew says that the father of the child with inoperable cancer should simply give up faith in God, if you remember back to that analogy. What would Mitchell, in this context, say to that analogy that Flew gave? Well, he would say that the father should continue to have faith and to work through the conflict. What about those who are accused of having blind faith, like Richard Hare's lunatic, the insane blik? Well, Mitchell doesn't need to argue that all religious believers are thoughtful and reasonable. He just needs to argue that some of them are. Moving on, Mitchell explains 3 ways here that religious statements can be understood and why he thinks that they are what he calls significant articles of faith, a really important term that we're going to unpack in just a moment. So what are Mitchell's 3 different ways of interpreting religious statements? Let's highlight them. The first here is as provisional hypotheses. Now, these are scientific ideas which he says are to be discarded if experience tells against them. As soon as contradictory evidence turns up, they get discarded. It would be irrational to hold on to an idea with such evidence against it. And Flew thinks this of religious language, but Mitchell thinks that this is mistaken. The second, he refers to as significant articles of faith, which is the key one. These are beliefs that we are committed to, things that make a big difference to how we live our lives. And Mitchell argues that reasonable belief will fall into this category. And the third he mentions are as vacuous formulae. Vacuous means empty. Empty beliefs, beliefs that never change based on experience, and they make no impact or difference to our lives. Richard Hare's bliks, in other words, come under this category, the kind of qualified religious statements that Flew attacks. Mitchell agrees that religious believers sometimes end up doing this, but it is a mistaken view and fairly rare. Now, how does Mitchell's use of Jesus being tempted by the devil to prove he's the Son of God, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God, be a rejection of the provisional hypotheses interpretation? Let's just highlight the quote, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. How is Mitchell using this? Well, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. True believers should trust in God and not try to catch him out by testing his love. Here, Jesus resists the devil and doesn't test, as you can see in the image, doesn't test whether his Father in heaven would send the angels to catch his fall and prove he had special status or not. Therefore, Mitchell rejects the provisional hypothesis argument in this case by using this as an example. Now, what does Mitchell believe religious believers are in constant danger? Let's highlight that. Constant danger of doing. Well, he believes that they're in constant danger of letting their faith turn into, number 3, vacuous formulae. That is what he is arguing, that religious believers are constantly in danger of doing. He agrees with Antony Flew that this is a big problem. What does Mitchell believe it would be for a religious believer if they turned their faith into a vacuous formula? Well, this is what he says. It would be a failure in faith as well as logic. Think about these ideas for a moment. When England crashed out of the World Cup against Croatia, are they never going to form a team and enter again as though it were a provisional hypothesis? Well, of course not. Having an England football team is more of a significant article of faith. The country are going to keep forming one, even if they keep losing. If someone has a conservative party, set of conservative party values, and these are centre-right political views, will they switch to Labour Party values, which are centre-left, if they won the next general election? Well, it's very unlikely, as their politics are a significant article of faith for them. With the referendum to leave the EU not yet resulting in a departure, some people might question whether democracy still works. But will the UK remove its parliamentary democracy simply because there's been this long delay or an unknown future? Well, no, because as democracy in the UK has become a significant article of faith, and that dates all the way back to the Magna Carta. And then much later in 1918 with the Representation of the People Act. People will continue to believe, even reluctantly, as they struggle with the full force of the conflict and face their trial of faith regarding during the Brexit negotiations in democracy. So does Mitchell think that it's easy being religious? Well, no, because they've got to be prepared to admit that they were wrong, to question their beliefs, to recognize things that contradict them. But at the same time, they must persevere. It's no easier being political, for example, or scientific, or trusting someone enough to love them when the evidence says that you should believe otherwise. So why for Mitchell does it not matter when a religious believer puts off admitting their assertions were wrong? Well, it doesn't matter because they can put off admitting the mistake or that they were wrong, not because the assertions are meaningless, but because they are committed to them. So here, Flew concludes the symposium and addresses the responses to his challenge, which was for religious believers to identify what would count as disproof of the love or existence of God. Notably, he comments on the responses here by Hare and by Mitchell. So part D, Flew. Flew concludes by thanking the other symposiasts and restating his falsification principle. He refers to University, we can highlight that there. And this is the magazine, the original magazine where the debate was originally published in 1950. But the anthology that you use comes from a reprint by Basil Mitchell in 1971. Now, what does Flew restate and why? Well, Flew restates his falsification principle, but he makes it much clearer here when you read it. He says this: the challenge, it will be remembered, ran like this. So he goes on to restate it in a clearer way. Now let's highlight the clear summary he makes of the falsification principle. And we can find that here. An explanation. To be an explanation at all must explain why this particular thing occurs and not something else. That's the summary that he gives. So who does Flew believe blatantly ignore this? Well, he calls them the sophisticated religious people. We can see that here. These are the people that blatantly ignore. Now, what does he think their religious language becomes and why? He says of these people that their religious language becomes bogus and vacuous. That's because they don't allow their statements to be disproved. Now, here's an interesting point. Who are the sophisticated religious believers that Flew is targeting here in the clearer outline of his original challenge? Well, these are the liberal religious thinkers like Tillich, who see revelation as symbolic, whereas fundamentalists have a very different problem. Their beliefs can be falsified by science in some cases, but they carry on believing them regardless, such as those who are young Earth creationists, for example. Moving on, Flew addresses Mitchell's parable of the partisan and explains the flaws in it as he sees them. Let's highlight the three different views that Flew believes he and Mitchell have both in common. So let's find them here. The first is that theological utterances must be assertions. Label that number one. Unlike Richard Hare, who thinks that they are simply bliks. The second view that Flew believes he has in common with Mitchell is the one where it says there must be something that would count against their truth. In other words, religious belief can be falsified. And the third view that Flew believes he and Mitchell have in common are where it says believers are in constant danger of transforming their would-be assertions into vacuous formulae, making their beliefs, in other words, empty and meaningless when they refuse to allow them to be falsified. Now, what does Flew admit he was wrong about and gives way to Mitchell about? Well, he admits that he was wrong to suggest all religious believers respond to contradictory evidence by qualifying their beliefs. He says that here when he says, I think he is right. I should have made a distinction. I should have made a distinction. The way I stressed was the expedient of qualifying the original assertion. He admits, in other words, that Mitchell is right in that most religious believers will look for an explanation for the contradiction instead of qualifying it in, as we read here, the way the theologian usually takes at first is to admit that it looks bad, but to insist that there is some explanation which will show that in spite of appearances, there must be a God. So he admits Mitchell's right, that they'll go looking for an explanation for the contradiction instead of qualifying it, and this is what he says here. The way the theologian usually takes it first is to admit that it looks bad, and then they will then look for some explanation. So he admits that he's been wrong earlier in his point. However, What might some of these explanations be that Flew alludes to? Well, he's going to be referring to various theodicies that seek to explain the problem of evil and suffering. And this is obvious because they're talking about the problem of believing in a, as it says here, a God who loves us. However, why doesn't Antony Flew believe that Mitchell's solution works in the long term? Well, he thinks that Mitchell is buying time and delaying the inevitable. And we read that here when he says his difficulty is that he has given God attributes which rule out all possible saving explanations. So, how does Flew show this using the stranger, who is a man, in Mitchell's parable? Well, he shows this by pointing out that the stranger is not a good comparison for God. And he says that here when he says, "For the stranger is a man." Now, this means it's easy for him to have a valid reason for not always helping the partisan. He cannot be everywhere at once. We said this earlier. He might have to allow evil things to take place as a means to good. God, however, is omnipotent. Therefore, there is no reason for God to allow evil and suffering. There's no reasonable, valid reason we could possibly accept. So what does God have that the stranger doesn't? Well, we read here, God has attributes. God has attributes which rule out all possible saving explanations. And we highlighted that a moment ago as well. So what does Flew conclude from all of this? Well, he concludes that Mitchell hasn't actually shown religious language to be meaningfully true. Initially, believers' first move is to look for an explanation. And we read that down here. The theologian's first move is to look for an explanation. He agrees with Mitchell about that. But Mitchell hasn't shown religious language to be meaningfully true, because whilst theologians' first move is to look for an explanation, in the long term, he says here that they will resort to the avoiding action of qualification. Therefore, he accuses Mitchell's parable of showing that in the end, religious language is false. Now, what other topic and scholar you've studied is Flew's description here useful for? Well, it's useful for the problem of evil. Remember Mackey's evil and omnipotence essay. What mistake might Flew be making when tackling the problem of evil theodicies? Think upon the free will defense for a moment. The issue we have here with Flew is that he assumes the theodicies don't solve the problem of evil. But there are many believers out there that would argue Augustine, Irenaeus, Plantinga's free will defense, that these are all very successful theodicies. Plantinga's free will defense, for example, shows how it might be reasonable to believe in God in a world with evil. What would Mackey say, however? Well, if you've studied the Mackey anthology, these these solutions, he would say, are either half-hearted and adequate, or they will be too fallacious, riddled with errors. Now, what's the actual purpose of Mitchell's parable compared to the focus that Flew has in his rebuttal? Well, the purpose of Mitchell's parable here is to solve Flew's challenge that he laid down, not to solve the problem of evil. Flew is going down, it seems, the wrong garden path. Excuse the pun. Instead of solving the problem of evil, then, how is Mitchell's view similar to John Hick's? Well, he doesn't have an answer to the problem of evil. After all, his parable wasn't trying to solve it. He argued that things do seem to falsify religious belief, that believers will admit this, but they will continue to trust things are not quite what they seem to be, even though that they don't seem to be, because of a commitment that they have. Now apply this to the problem of evil and you realize that Mitchell doesn't have an answer right now. But in the afterlife, he might find out. Now this is John Hick's eschatological verification principle. Until then, we will make do with the hope that we have in the same way that the partisan holds on to his hope that the stranger is still on his side. Flue now focuses on Hare's concepts of bliks, which he regards as mistaken. Now, what are Flue's two objections that he has to Hare's view that religious language is non-falsifiable but still meaningful? Well, the first is that bliks are not a genuine religious idea. In this case, no Christian would truly argue he believes that their belief is a blik. In fact, he gets a bit personal with Richard Hare. He says, if Hare's religion really is a blik, involving no cosmological assertions about the nature and activities of a supposed personal creator, then surely he is not a Christian at all. That's the first objection he makes, that bliks are not real religious ideas. And no real Christian or religious believer is going to accept that. The second objection he makes are that bliks are not meaningful at all in any way. He says they could scarcely do the job that they do. If they were not even intended as assertions, then many religious activities would become fraudulent or merely silly. Now, if Flue is right that religious believers don't regard their statements as bliks, what does he accuse Richard Hare's own Christian beliefs as being? Well, he says it when he writes this. He regards them as being entirely unorthodox. Hare doesn't go along with the traditional, genuine beliefs, he says. Now, why might it seem that Richard Hare cannot win with Flue no matter what he believes? Well, this is rather interesting. Flue was originally attacking the sophisticated believers, if you remember. And who were they? They were people like Tillich and Hick, who were liberal thinkers, not the fundamentalists who believe things literally and see their statements as factual. Yet when Richard Hare plays the role of the sophisticated believer here, Flue accuses him of being entirely unorthodox. He can't seem to win. Now, what does Flue mean when he says, you ought, but it is God's will? Let's highlight that. You ought because it is God's will. Well, he's giving the example of a believer who says, you ought because it is God's will. If religious language is a blik, then this is just like saying, you should believe it because you should. And adding the phrase, because it's God's will at the end, doesn't do anything to the sentence if religious language is purely a blik. It means nothing, in other words. We might draw some parallels here with C.S. Lewis in our previous thinking, who argues that just because you put the words God can at the end of a sentence, it doesn't mean that he can. What analogy does Flue use here to reinforce this point? Well, he uses a slightly out-of-date analogy for us today, the analogy of cashing and if we highlight it, a dialectical dud check. What is a check? Let's just get ourselves acquainted with a check. Now, a check is an order to pay the bank a stated sum of money from the drawer's account. And it's in written form, as you can see an example of there. You need to have the money in your account if you're going to write a check, because it used to take, well, it still does if you use them today, it takes a number of days for the money to be transferred. If you don't keep the right amount of money in your account, the check is going to bounce and it's going to be fraudulent, or it's going to be a dud, as Flue refers to here. Now, what is a dud check? I've just said that. It's when a check bounces or is refused because the drawer's account doesn't have enough money in it. So how does Antony Flew use this analogy to explain away bliks? Well, writing a check, he says, to clear his overdraft, as we highlight here, clear his overdraft by writing his bank a check from the same account that has no money in it, is just, he says, as silly as the religious believer's blik. They sound impressive, but they cannot be turned into meaningful reasons or justifications. The check here might look impressive, but it's completely and utterly useless and meaningless if there's no money in the account. And therefore, religious utterances, he says, may indeed express false or even bogus assertions. Now, is Flew right to argue that most Christians are not like Richard Hare and think of their beliefs as bliks? Well, yes, he probably is right. Most would think that their beliefs are factual statements. They often make falsifiable statements like belief in a literal hell or heaven. Their beliefs don't die the death of 1,000 qualifications. So how does Flew's stronger criticism that bliks are really like dud checks link to Hotspur's idea that we had at the end of the last anthology between Flew and extract between Flew and Hare? We looked at Hotspur's ideas. How do Flew's stronger criticism that bliks are really like dud checks link to Hotspur's idea of impure bliks mentioned at the end of the last anthology? Well, if you remember this, Hotspur argued that religious bliks are always insane rather than sane, because they start out as assertions but pretend to be bliks when they're falsified. And so sane bliks, or he calls them pure bliks, are unfalsifiable because they express something that nobody objects to, the view that makes no difference to other people. Whereas insane bliks, or he calls them impure bliks, are falsifiable and they make a difference in other people's lives. Take the holy herb, as Rastafarians like to call it. We may be acquainted with it as the illegal drug marijuana. It's a natural drug, they will argue, that God has created for us to get closer to him with. Now, this is not a personal preference. It is stating why something should be legalized. A religious believer isn't going to admit that their blik is insane, are they? They're going to say that it's a sane blik, because it means something to them. Therefore, this admits that it isn't really explaining or justifying anything to anyone but yourself. Because if we take Hotspur's idea that sane bliks actually are only effectively useful for the people that have them, then we end up arguing that it isn't doing anything at all when we hold it. But we wouldn't also argue that our belief is an insane blik. So writing a check that cannot actually do anything to solve the problem is just the same. And so we come to the end. Flew concludes by linking religious language to what's called doublethink. And this is a phrase that appears in the famous novel 1984 by George Orwell. Now, Flew draws from Orwell's famous dystopian novel 1984. So what is the concept of doublethink? Let's highlight that word. Concept of doublethink here. Well, Orwell's 1984 is set in the dystopian future with a government who are known as the party, and we can highlight that here because he's quoting from the book directly. The party. This is the government. The party has employees that work for the party. And these employees know that they are putting out false news, false propaganda to control people and manipulate them. But they convince themselves in the process that it is actually true, because the party can never be wrong. And Orwell calls this trick of convincing yourself something is true when you know that it is false as doublethink. It says here, doublethink. He also satisfies himself that reality is not violated. So how does Flew think doublethink links to religious language? Well, believers convince themselves that something is true. Let's say a loving God is in charge of this world. But at the same time, their ordinary experience of the world tells them that this is false when they encounter things like evil and suffering all around them. Let's quote the ending here. Driven to doublethink in order to retain their faith in a loving God in face of the reality of a heartless and indifferent world. So why is Flew a little bit harsh here in his final response to Hare and Mitchell, or in what way is he a bit harsh? Well, he challenges Hare and Mitchell in the beginning. They respond thoughtfully and give their very well thought out responses. And then Flew, right at the end, suggests that all believers, religious believers, including Hare and Mitchell, are brainwashed like the party members in George Orwell's 1984. A little bit harsh. What might a good counter argument to Antony Flew be then here at this final hurdle? Let's think back to John Frame's alternative parable that you would have studied before. Maybe atheists have their own version of doublethink if they are also showing a commitment to an idea, holding on to their belief that there is no God, even with evidence that shows that there might be. If atheism is a blik, as Hare suggests, it would also engage in doublethink. This is a criticism that might be used back against Flew.